have the Chief Trust Officer with Evernym. This is, personally for me, identity. I consider that to be the first major battlefield within the blockchain space, because identity plays such a critical part of so many applications that will eventually live on blockchains. And so this discussion is designed to actually set the framework, set the foundation for identity, self-sovereign identity, what it is, what's required in order for self-sovereign identity to be viable and useful. And then afterwards, we're going to go into a panel discussion with some of the experts in this space along with Drummond. So with that, I introduce you to Drummond Reed. Go get him.
Oh, welcome. How many folks thought that that was the best lunch you've had at a conference in the last decade? Put your hand up. I ate way too much, and I told Chris, if all the rest of the conference is the quality of that lunch, we're in fine hands. So I'm here to give you the second talk today that I've heard about self-sovereign identity. If you didn't hear Chris Spanton's talk earlier, it was fabulous. Set a great tone for what I'm going to talk about here. And I give you a little sense, I am not from the blockchain space. I've been brought into this, unlike most of the other speakers you have here today. And let's see if the green button is actually going to do something. There you go. So my background's actually been entirely in internet identity for the last 20 years. And I've been involved in acres of standards in this space. I've been to all 26 instances of the Internet Identity Workshop that I'll tell you a little bit more about later. And I wear 7 different hats in this space. At Evernym, I'm the Chief Trust Officer, but I'm one of the trustees of the Sovereign Foundation that I'm going to tell you more about here, and I chair the Sovereign Trust Working Group. So we are building self-sovereign identity infrastructure, and we're doing it based on open standards that I'm also going to tell you a little bit about. So I like to start out with a very clear picture, of course, why we're doing blockchain. It has nothing to do with ICOs. Even though I know that's a popular topic here, there's another cartoon that actually we take much more seriously in the identity space, and it's this one. You've probably all seen this cartoon. You may or may not know that it's the most reprinted New Yorker cartoon in history. When we licensed that for a paper from the Sovereign Foundation, the New Yorker actually told us it's about 1/3 more reprints of that cartoon than any other cartoon they've ever done. Now, that's not a good example of just how serious the problem of internet identity is. We turned around and adapted that cartoon for the Internet Identity Workshop, which, as I mentioned earlier, the next one in October is number 27. That's twice a year for the last 13 years that over 200 people from around the world have come together working on the problem of internet identity. That's how deep and persistent of a problem it is. That conference was actually started based on something called Identity Commons, which was based on the ideas of a gentleman called Dee Hock, who wrote Birth of the Chaotic Age. And if you don't recognize Dee Hock's name, you'll probably recognize that the institution that he founded, which is based on these ideas of a chaotic organization, a term that we would nowadays use the term decentralized. And he is a big believer in that. I actually met with him 2 weeks ago with the president of CU Ledger. And he's 90 years old. He's still sharp as a tack. And I wrote 19 pages worth of quotes in a day and a half meeting with him. When I found this picture online, I was curious where it came from. And that was actually the tweet that included his picture. It's worth taking a second just to read that, especially that center middle paragraph. Bitcoin is one of the best examples of how a decentralized peer-to-peer organization can solve problems that these dated organizations cannot. Now that suggests to you how blockchain can solve problems of decentralization that have nothing directly to do with cryptocurrency. They have everything to do with identity. And when it comes to blockchains and governments, it may change the technology even more than anything else that's come before, including the internet. And the reason is self-sovereign identity and decentralized trust. So to explain this, I want to make sure you understand why is it a watershed in digital identity. And to do that, I want to quickly run through what are the 3 models of digital identity that we've been through in the history of the internet. We all started with siloed identity. Siloed because your identity, oh, it's interesting the way that wrapped. That's actually supposed to be ORG there. You are a dotted circle in this diagram because you don't exist on the internet without an account at some site or some service. It might be an individual website, might be a social network, might be your company, but whatever. You are your accounts. And every username and password represents another one of those accounts that you have the credentials for. Obviously, as we went out on the internet and we started developing hundreds of relationships, we ended up with an enormous amount of pain that we needed to solve. But I want to point out, even solving just the problem of how you securely log into a site on the internet took 7 years worth of standards work on what's now the most widely adopted form of encryption in the world, SSL. So we needed to solve that pain, and we did it by introducing a new form of service provider, the identity provider, or what's called federated identity. Now you have an account with that provider, and that provider will log you into all the systems that you need, well, hopefully as many systems as that provider can reach. One of the problems with federated identity is that there's no provider that serves all systems, so you have to be members of multiple federations. Another problem is that there aren't providers that meet all the requirements. You can't use Facebook to log in to your bank account. But just getting to this stage of inserting a provider and standardizing how that would be done took another 3 generations of standards, 15 years worth of work. SAML, OAuth, OpenID Connect. We've made a lot of progress. It's solved a lot of problems, but it hasn't solved the problem or come anywhere close. So that leads us to this 3rd generation, the watershed, self-sovereign identity. And the picture of that goes back to something that does have just you and the peer you're interacting with. But notice now that it's not an account anymore. You are, under self-sovereign identity, a full-fledged peer of anyone else, or any other person, any other organization, or any other connected thing on the internet anywhere. And you don't have an account, you have a connection. If I handed one of you a business card, I wouldn't say, thank you for forming an account with me. We are forming a connection. That's even what it's called on LinkedIn. And I don't have anywhere near the 30,000 connections that hits the limit, by the way. So if you look at this picture, what is blockchain doing there at the bottom? Why does it solve the problem? Well, here's why, and that's why I'm holding this. My #1 example of decentralized identity. It's really no more complicated than you have a digital wallet. And in that wallet, you have credentials exactly the way you have credentials in a real-world wallet today. If I need to go prove that as a US citizen I can board a plane, I take one of the credentials I was issued from someone that the TSA trusts, I put it in this wallet, I go to the airport, I show it to TSA, they verify the credential, and I get on the plane. So how does that work digitally? Well, we need to take this. This is where I have to get out my other prop. We need to take what we do with this, and we need to put it on this. Now, digital wallets are nothing new. They existed before blockchain and cryptocurrency, and now we all think about cryptocurrency wallets, and they're critically important, but we're not talking about a cryptocurrency wallet. We're talking about what's called an identity wallet because what it contains is these. Doesn't mean it won't have tokens. In fact, it makes a lot of sense that you'll have a universal wallet that will do both. But we're concentrating on solving the problem of putting this wallet on your phone. Now, that gives you the wallet, but where do you get the credentials? Well, you could issue them yourself, just like I can put a business card in this wallet. And if I give it to you, it gives you a certain amount of information, would instill a certain amount of peer-to-peer trust, but it's not going to get me on a plane at the airport. So you need to go get a credential. But you do it exactly the same way I would go get a credential in this wallet today. I go find the peer that will be trusted to give me that credential, and they issue it to me right into my digital wallet. And now if I need to go present that credential, like to TSA, I will turn around and click, show them the credential in a way that they can verify it. How many folks in coming to this conference used a mobile boarding pass to get on your plane? That's the experience you're going to have of showing something like a digital driver's license or a digital passport or a digital employment credential. Now, what makes it trusted? How can you trust these credentials? That's where the blue line comes in. You need a way to be able, when the credential is issued, for the verifier, the peer that is going to accept that credential, to say, I want to verify the signature on that credential. I want to know it really came from the Washington State Driver's License Association or the US government or my employer or my sports club, whatever it is. That's what the problem we're solving with a blockchain. As you all know, blockchains are built on cryptography. They're a triple play of cryptography. So using a blockchain as a globally referenceable, verifiable, strong source of truth for a public key, that's the problem that it solves for digital identity. In fact, there are exactly 4 standards that are needed in this space to deliver this entire infrastructure. The first one at that bottom level is called DIDs, Decentralized Identifiers. I'm the co-author of the DID specification at the W3C, and it's an incredibly simple idea. Give a public key an address on a blockchain, an address that never needs to change, so you can rotate the key, and you can rotate the other metadata associated with it on that blockchain, and anyone that you need to share it with can read it and verify it. It is the foundational space. Almost all the companies in this space, blockchain identity companies, are now using the DID standard. The second one, click, is called DKMS, Decentralized Key Management System. There's no way we can have self-sovereign identity if you get locked into a wallet, right? Using Apple Pay today, using Google Pay, you are using a proprietary wallet on a proprietary platform. Might work for them. It's not going to work for us as digital citizens of the world. We need to have our credentials, our private keys. They need to be portable and among wallets. The third one, how do you authenticate between 2 peers with DIDs? It's actually incredibly easy once you have the rest of this infrastructure in place. It's just a one incremental improvement on top of the standards I told you about earlier. And lastly, of course, you've got to standardize the format of those credentials. Verifiable credentials is actually the most mature of these 4 standards. I'll pop over to this next page and show, oops. I see it's an earlier version. I'm going to back up there. That slide's not in this version of the presentation. Verifiable credentials is a working group at the W3C that's 2 years into its work. It should be completed by mid-2019, and that will standardize the format of digital credentials. This work has already been embraced by some of the largest companies in the industry, including IBM. Microsoft is very involved, and there's typical tussles about that final format, but it's going to come out, and we're all going to be, all the companies in this space are committed to using it. So this open standard ecosystem for verifiable credentials, self-sovereign identity, is not just it's not a story. It's being implemented right now. Chris Spanton gave a great talk about it earlier today. At the Linux Foundation, which is the home of the Hyperledger project, the code for self-sovereign identity, both the ledger, an open standard ledger for doing it, and the digital wallets and agents you need to communicate it, was contributed about 18 months ago and is the Hyperledger Indie project. T-Mobile, as Chris mentioned, is one of 44 what are called stewards of the Sovereign Foundation that are going to be running a hybrid blockchain. It's a global blockchain in which all the nodes are run by trusted institutions. And you can see the full list on the Sovereign Foundation website at sovereign.org. Now, in the final part of this presentation, since I want to tie it directly into the question about what are governments actually going to do with this? How is this going to work? I want to turn around and talk about another government. It's not yet a sovereign steward, but they are building on top of Sovereign, and in fact, they've become one of the most active contributors to the Hyperledger Indie code base. And I have to give credit to our neighbors to the north. This is British Columbia. If you're not in the digital identity space, you may not know that they are one of the most progressive digital governments in the world. And all of Canada is leading the world in digital identity, but British Columbia is leading Canada. And the next slides I'm going to show are with permission from John Jordan, the Executive Director of Emerging Digital Initiatives in British Columbia. And they're slides that he showed a month ago at the Pacific Northwest Economic Region Conference to explain to a non-technical audience the problem they were solving. So if you're not technical, or even if you are, I think you'll appreciate this. It's how are they going to solve a key problem of citizens interacting with governments and do it in a way that any citizen is going to be able to engage. So the way they they explain the problem is talk about something that any of you that have opened a business or had to apply for some kind of business license or associated government paperwork are familiar with. The paper document trail is incredibly cumbersome, and it's almost entirely non-digital today. I see the wrap on these slides. It's not worked very well. It's produced islands of information at the various registries and government agencies that you need to interact with. They don't talk to each other, and they're not interoperable. Click, there we go. So if we want to take an example of Mary, who wants to start a bakery, she requires a whole set of documents in order to get that going. Some are obvious, some are not. She has to do her homework. She has to take a journey through multiple sources, hopefully websites that are all linked to each other, but she has to turn around and make sense of that whole thing. And they all interact with her in different ways, and if she's going to set up and get accounts to apply for these things, she's going to need a different username and password with every one of those sites. This is a major burden on any small business owner, as you know if you've been through it. So what if businesses could provide these verifiable proofs, if they could obtain them easily in a sequence that is they're helped through by the government, and in the end up with these digital proofs of the verifiable credentials for their business in their own wallet, able to assert wherever they're needed online. This picture really summarizes the essence of the verifiable claims universe. You've got issuers of claims, holders of claims like Mary, in this case for her business as a business owner, but she would also hold claims as an individual, and the verifiers of those claims, like TSA or wherever she needs to go and show one of those licenses. What they call the identifier registry at the bottom is the blockchain where those DIDs are registered. BC Gov is going to be using the sovereign chain. So the team there, starting almost 18 months ago, said, how are we going to go do this? How are we going to get this set up? And they recognized that, as with many other things in blockchain, it's a big chicken or egg problem. How do they kickstart the market? They took a survey of all the services they were offering in British Columbia, said, what can we plug into to get this rolling? And they had a brilliant idea. They started a proof of concept back then for what they call the org book. And the org book is really, in its heart, it's a very simple service to understand. Imagine all of the 31 agencies in British Columbia that issue businesses credentials, whether it's to register, or it's a health certificate, or it's a business license. If they could all send a digital version, a verifiable credential, cryptographically signed, to a centralized service, yes, you hear centralized, in order to form a directory of those credentials, it's available to everyone, to all the citizens, all the other government agencies, all the businesses in British Columbia, and everyone in the world. So you're taking a decentralized system of producing these credentials, and you're actually creating a centralized registry for one particular province. And this isn't an ordinary directory. These are actually digitally signed, verifiable credentials that you can go and check the signatures on anything listed there. It's a cryptographic directory. So those claims, as they come in, are they're each digitally signed by the issuing authority, and they're issued to the org book as a holder of those claims, in addition to as soon as the business owner has their own wallet, the same claim will be issued to them. It's two separate instances, and you can verify them in either case. It's one of the things you can do with this combination of crypto and blockchains. This whole enrollment experience will be much more convenient for someone like Mary, and in fact, they're building what they call recipes for taking a business owner through the whole set of claims that they need from different organizations to automate that experience that otherwise a human has to understand. In the end, even with every a license or registration that Mary's business needs going to the org book so it's publicly visible, as soon as Mary has her own digital wallet, she will get all those claims for her business herself. and she can delegate them to her employees. So now she's in a position to automate her interaction with every other service she needs to go to. This is a way of breaking the chicken or egg problem for digital credentials for Mary. So she can focus on what she does best. This has already, the org book service has not launched yet. The good news is, as I mentioned earlier, they've become the #1 contributors to the Hyperledger Indy project, and it will launch. I can't be specific because they have not announced the launch date, but I can tell you it's coming this fall, well before Christmas. And if you're interested in any more about that, I think I've got, I don't have the org book URL on this slide, but if you literally do a search on the org book, one string, you can get all the information about that. There's the link for sovereign.org, of course, Hyperledger as well. And I will be here in the speaker's room and around for the next 2 days if you have any questions about self-sovereign identity or Sovereign and what we're doing there. And again, thanks to Chris and any other of the Sovereign stewards that are here. Appreciate it.